Complicated Creation by Elemental. Chapter 12. Terrible Legacy. Hisashi watches as Shota storms out of the room. There's a pause as everyone takes stock. Deku looks carefully blank. Totoro is upset but keeping a stiff upper lip. Nezu is unreadable as always. Kayama is rubbing at her temple, lips pursed, and Yagi looks like he's considering going after Shota, and that is going to go over like a house on fire. Hisashi pushes himself up. "I'll go after him," he tells the room, still echoing from Shota's outburst. "You thought I'd better come up with a foolproof way to keep Deku safe, because if he gets hurt in the process of all of this..." He waves a hand in a vague circle of this. "I don't think Shota's going to forgive you." "I'll be okay," Deku insists as Hisashi heads for the door. "Tell him I'm sorry, but I'm going to do this." Hisashi hesitates and looks over his shoulder at the kid, and Deku's got that look he's seen before. Not on this kid, but on others. On Shinso. On Aizawa. Hisashi is not the feelings guy out of their group, but he crouches down in front of Deku and prods him on the arm gently until Deku looks at him. "Shota's upset, but this isn't your fault," he says, hating the audience but refusing to let Deku just stand there and think Shota might throw him away for one disagreement. "He lost his cool, but he'll come around. He's worried about keeping you safe. And about people taking advantage of you, he thinks but doesn't say out loud because unlike some people might suggest he does, he in fact have tact. I'll talk to him, but don't think he's given up on you yet. He's both way too much of a stubborn asshole and someone who cares too much to do that. And if you tell him I said that, I will deny it and call you a bald-faced liar. Got it?" He winks, and behind him Yagi starts a quiet laugh. "Okay." Deku smiles. It's a little lopsided, and it doesn't meet his eyes, but it's something better than the blank expression he had moments before. "Good! Now you! Make plans about whatever you have to do to be safe, and Shota will talk to you again tomorrow." Hisashi needs to take his husband home, really, but that's not going to happen. A quiet night in 1A's dorms is the best he can manage right now. Deku nods, and Hisashi takes that as the best he'll get as he turns and heads out to find Shota, preferably before he breaks something. He has to at least be glad that Shota can't go out on patrol right now. An angry Eraserhead tended to bring back villains in more pieces than they started with. He checks Shota's usual haunts, including his classroom, the supply closet he likes to nap in, the small training gym that was usually used for independent study and staff purposes, all to no avail. He's heading towards the dorms when he sees Shota coming out from behind them, hands in his pockets and head tucked down into his scarf, shoulders hunched, his whole form just radiating anger and frustration. He sees Hisashi and sighs loud enough to be heard in the quiet of the night, and Hisashi jogs forward before Shota tries to take off on him. "You're taking this harder than I think anyone expected," Hisashi offers once he's close enough not to need to shout. "Oh, really?" is Shota's response, and the tone itself carries layers of derision. "What was your first indication?" "Come on, Shota, don't be like that!" Hisashi nudges him, trying to get it to lighten up. "They're not bringing the kid to the Tartarus. They want to do it at the hospital. He'll have heroes there. You can be there. He says he'll be fine." "Fine. Like he was fine when living on the streets, or fine like when he was living in a flop house, or fine like when he gave up a childhood memory to get me home in one piece." Hisashi knows Shota's angry, but this level of vitriol is surprising even for him, because I've known this kid for 2 weeks, and fine is not something I trust him to make a goddamn judgment call on. Hisashi has to lean back because Shota's so upset that his hair's starting to lift. "That's what we're going to be there for, then, to look after him." "That's just it," Shota snaps. Hisashi has seen him this angry on very few occasions, and it hasn't been directed at him in a very long time. "None of you actually believe him or me, do you?" "What?" "The spirits." Shota scowls. "You don't believe they're real independent creatures that can fuck that kid up." "I never said that!" Hisashi holds his hands up, placating. "I believe you went through something that none of us can really get, and I don't know about spirits, but it's obvious it has something to do with quirks, right? Like you said, personification. But if All For One could cause trouble for us outside of Tartarus, he'd be doing it, wouldn't he? You can't really think he'd cause problems for Deku under all of our noses." Hisashi wants to believe Shota. Of course he does, but magic is still a little hard to wrap his head around. A weird quirk makes way more sense, and Harage had confirmed that Shota's memories hadn't been really played with, but some quirks could still create things that were real when you experienced them. No one thinks Deku's a villain at this point, but having his quirk properly tested with, machines and things, that'd be good, right?
Hitoshi's quirk found us in Miyazaki. If he could do that, there's no reason All For One's quirk couldn't do the same. I watched Aries' quirk give Deku a concussion and pinned him to the floor.
Shota runs a hand through his hair to pull it away from his eyes, which are more bloodshot than usual.
Do you really think we can fight something invisible, intangible, that can only harm Deku? Because I don't think we can!
You think his spirit could do that? Why wouldn't he try now then?
I don't know.
Shota rocks back on his heels.
I don't know. Maybe he doesn't know about Deku. Maybe he's avoiding Deku because the kid's got some serious power, and whatever his spirit is doesn't want to mess with him. Maybe he's waiting for a chance to do something when our backs are turned. I don't know. And I can't protect this kid from an invisible enemy. And I can barely protect this kid from himself. He literally just finished helping Eri. He helped Mirio. Chiyo says he hasn't gained weight yet, and he should have. We should be protecting him, not throwing him at a problem the minute we think he can solve it for us.
Shota's chest is heaving, and Hisashi realizes he's misjudged this. He thought Shota was just upset about no one listening to him about Deku, because he was having parental feelings, even if he didn't have much legal say yet. He thought Shota was upset at them going over his head. Shota's not mad at them for undermining him. Shota's afraid. Hisashi steps in close and takes Shota's hands, about the most he could do out in the open like this. Shota only shuts down when he tries to be demonstrative in public. He squeezes them, and it makes things a tiny bit better when Shota doesn't yank away from his grasp. "I'm sorry," he says, because first and foremost, he messed up here, and Shota's wired to listen when someone says they're sorry, as messed up as that can be sometimes. "I'm sorry, I don't entirely believe you yet. I want to, and I'm trying, but it's hard." But he can try harder. He can damn well try harder. "I don't think Totoro would have asked on a whim, Shota. I get the feeling that Tomoko's in bad shape if he came here to ask when Deku's barely gotten settled, right? And if we're going to protect him, maybe the best way to start is to get him under the eye of some experts so they can see what happens around him. The first way to defend him is to understand what's going on. If it's magic," Hisashi has to stretch his memory as far as it will go, "then we cover him in those wards he has, or sew salt packets into all of his clothes, or have a dozen priests come and purify the school and our apartment and his uniforms. Whatever it takes," Hisashi promises. Shota glares at him through his bangs, but it's a much more familiar sort of glare, tired instead of angry. It means he's listening. Good. "If you really think he's going to be in danger like this, we should find out everything we can now so we can work on looking after him. Otherwise, maybe you're right and something will come after him when we're not prepared." He takes a risk and smiles just a little. "Don't you always teach your students that proper intel is the first step to any mission, Mr. I work in the dead of the night? Who the fuck supplied these blueprints?" It drags up from Shota, which might as well be a full-bloody laugh the state he's in. Hisashi curls his fingers, and Shota returns the gesture, breathing evening out as he sighs.
You might have a point.
Oh, might have a point. That's pretty close to saying I'm right, you know.
Don't get too cocky.
Shota's grip gets tighter for just a moment, and then he lets go.
I still don't like this.
I know! Hisashi nods and nudges Shota towards the dorms. I promised them you'd check in tomorrow, and promised them you weren't angry at him. Told the others they need to come up with a plan to keep him safe. Tomorrow we can tear it apart and see what else we can add to it. Besides, Hisashi adds as they stop at the stairs leading to the dorm's front doors, I've only known him for like 2 weeks, and I get the feeling he wouldn't have said no to Totoro, no matter what we decided. Kid's basically a hero in training already. Shota sighs and shakes his head and surprises Hisashi by leaning in just a little, pressing their shoulders together.
That's the problem,
he admits, talking to the door more than to Hisashi.
He's not in training yet.
Preparing to face his possible future is actually pretty anticlimactic. They aren't taking him to Tartarus, not even near it. He's heading back to the hero hospital where Eri was kept, and everyone seems to think that he probably won't be able to fix Ragdoll's quirk exactly, but that he might be able to either tell them more about what happened to it, or give them research to further study it, and study all for one. He isn't even going to meet the man himself, just maybe, passively, his spirit. Aizawa isn't happy about it, obviously, and Tamamo no Mei hasn't shown up at all since Aizawa stormed out the night before, even though Izuku's called for her. He doesn't know what to think about that, except maybe she thinks, well, maybe she knows what he's going to find out and is afraid for him. Or afraid of him. She probably doesn't want to be around for it either way. Aizawa at least doesn't avoid him. Instead, he takes Izuku to get supplies. If he's going to do this, he wants to do it right. And if All for One Spirit does try to come after him, he tells Aizawa he can prepare for it a lot easier if the adults will let him and not think he's crazy. Aizawa at least stops looking so angry when Izuku explains what that entails, and walks with him to the nearest shrine where they buy a dozen Nugofu. Totoro's spirit says he will guard me, he tells Aizawa on their way back. But then he'll bring the other spirits from the Wild Pussycats in case anything does try to be aggressive, and I was going to use Sun Eater's quirk to make myself armor, just to be extra sure. Aizawa looks at it with tired red-rimmed eyes. Izuku's pretty sure he didn't sleep much last night, and it's entirely his fault. What? Well, I traded helping Sun Eater for using his quirk. I get to call on it 3 times. So I was thinking I can eat some clams in advance, and that way, if I need to, I can make body armor. He'd studied videos of Sun Eater in the sports festival late last night just to be sure that would work, and it seemed reasonable. Sun Eater used it only for parts of his body like a shield, but Izuku was pretty sure he could make it a keratin shell for his important bits. Aizawa is still looking at him while they walk. He seems about to say something, then stops and presses his lips together in a frown, then shakes his head.
Just how easy is it for you to use these favors exactly?
It's pretty straightforward as long as I know what to expect. The spirit channel's with me, so I can't... Izuku gestures with a hand. Just do it now. I have to call on them, and they have to appear, and then ask, and then they have to agree, and actually lend me the power. They could ignore me or refuse, but that would go against the contract, and that's a really big deal for spirits. He thinks about Tamamo no Mei and how easy that had been, how she hadn't even been touching him at the time. I usually try to be careful about what I use, since some favors are one time only, though I usually try to ask for a few.
Just what sort of spirits owe you exactly?
Aizawa asks, and Izuku still can't quite tell if he's annoyed at his answer or just tired. The question makes him pause, though, because, is it okay if I don't say? He asks in turn, a little unsure. It feels rude. It's their secrets, their debts, and a lot of them aren't happy to owe me at all. I only mention Deku because he knows I'll be calling on him later. Aizawa frowns a little more, but he shrugs and doesn't get upset, which Izuku can be glad for.
It's fine,
he says in a voice that implies it isn't fine and they'll be talking about it later, but Izuku can, well, deal with it later.
At least you're taking this seriously.
Of course I am! Izuku doesn't understand the statement. You think the others aren't?
I think that if your precautions fail us, we're going to be in trouble.
Aizawa tells him point blank.
I'm worried about what happens if something with a grudge comes after you here. At least I could fight them in the other place.
I'll fight them off, Izuku promises, touched by how worried Aizawa is. You saw before. I know how to look after myself.
Eri spirit gave you a concussion and nearly cracked your ribs.
He points out, voice flat. Well, yes, but I could have stopped him if it got worse. I was trying to convince him to stop before I had to. And he really had been on the cusp of having to fight back before Tamamo no Mei had arrived. Aizawa stops and puts a hand on his shoulder and turns him so that they're face to face.
Why didn't you, Deku? If you could stop him before he hurt you, why do you let them hurt you?
Izuku looks up at Aizawa, Eraserhead, the hero, and thinks of all the lies he could tell, the ones he would have told 2 weeks ago. He swallows them down. Because it always makes things worse in the end, he admits as Aizawa's grip on his shoulder tightens. Because it proves them right.
No,
Aizawa says, short and sharp and fierce.
Protecting yourself against others doesn't prove them right, even if you have to take their names to do it. That's like suggesting All Might is a violent and dangerous man because he is constantly punching villains.
Izuku doesn't know about that. You could argue that All Might was dangerous, depending on how you frame things. You couldn't suggest he was dangerous to civilians, unlike some other pro-heroes, but Aizawa makes an exasperated sound and glares through his bangs.
Are you trying to come up with ways to declare All Might dangerous?
No, Izuku lies badly.
Just this once, kid. I want you to promise me. If something comes after you today, you will fight back. Don't let them walk all over you. Don't let them hurt you. Fight back to protect yourself.
And become a monster? Izuku thinks as Aizawa's grip gets almost painful before he lets go. I'll try, he says, because he thinks if he lies outright, Aizawa will be able to tell and will try to stop him, and he wants to do this. He needs to do this. Aizawa doesn't look convinced, though, so he takes a breath and straightens his back. I don't want to get hurt, he says more firmly. That's the truth, after all. I'll protect myself. Also true. It's defending himself he has trouble with.
Good.
Aizawa seems to sag a little in relief.
Just good. Let's get back and see if everyone else has done their part.
In the space between the human world and the realm of the spirits, there is nothing. It is a special sort of nothing. It is time and space compressed, the place where spirits go to move from one point on Earth to another without boundaries. It is a space that exists in the margins, quite literally, and as a result, many travel through it without understanding it, without even knowing what they are accessing, as they do. Only the oldest know what the space truly is, and only the wisest can access it directly to use it as more than a thoroughfare. Mizuchi sits, and because he wills it, there is something to sit on in this nothingness. He has his human form here because it is polite to keep himself to a scale with his companions, and he prefers this to simply shrinking his true form down. Lady Kaio, dressed in silks, paces back and forth in a froth of motion, unbound by a theoretical weight of her layers, hair rippling around her shoulders and down her back.
You knew he did not understand,
Mizuchi asks, though it is more of a statement, an attempt to understand.
You have been with him. Why did you not explain?
Explain what? She turns, and everything around her ripples, even if there is no breeze. That he is being judged not on his own actions, but on the actions of a man nearly 2 centuries his senior. That the reason our kind thinks of him as a monster is entirely out of his control. That his existence points to a greater duty than simply digging sylphs out of old warts. She is angry, and she is beautiful in her anger. He has admired her ferocity ever since she first fell into his domain. He is, however, unfazed by her fury.
You could not explain that he is capable of making monsters, and that is why we find him monstrous. That the legacy before him is one that haunts many of us. He has seen what became of Madan Bashi.
Years ago, Mizuchi had known the Shisha spirit when it had been solely itself, a great lion and protector of Nahabe, long before it had become the terrible fusion of souls it now was.
How long until he makes another like him? Or worse?
He still mourns for his brother and will never be able to forgive the humans for what horror had been done to him. Even if Deku seems to mean well, truly he does, it cannot last. Humans are fickle after all. They change too much with the seasons. Deku will be their ally only until it suits him to be otherwise, and the damage he will do then is immense. I notice you didn't tell him anything. Lady Kaio ceases in her movements to glare at him directly. He is a child, Mizuchi.
I am aware.
And truly, he is aware of this. The child seems more than simply good and kind. He is thoughtful and intelligent.
But human children do not remain as they are. They become men.
Not all men are evil.
Not all men can control us at their whim. The human they call All for One was a child once. He was kind once. I remember, even if you do not.
He watches Lady Kaio frown at him, but the expression is brief across her delicate features, morphing into something like pity. He does not want her pity. He wants her to be safe.
I lost Ryujin. We have both lost too many to the monster the world gave us blindly. Please,
he pleads, hands flat on his knees.
For our friendship, if nothing else, do not give this boy the chance to claim you for himself.
And that is how you will repay him. She steps back and he realizes she is disappointed in him by the set of her brow and the curl of her lip. After what he has done for you, you will pay him in suspicion and nothing else. She is right. There is still honor to be considered.
I will find a way to make good for what he has done,
He tells her with a slight bow of acceptance.
but I will not place myself in the path of becoming his slave.
She sighs, and perhaps he is put out by her disappointment at the implication of his failure, despite his reasons. Perhaps he has lost her faith. Perhaps he is petty when he meets her gaze and holds it.
Have you at least told him the truth then? About your part in all of this?
My part is often grossly exaggerated. She snaps angry all over again. Because if it had more meaning, I would be owed more than a reminder of my part. Her sulks swirl as she steps away, moving to leave, slicing the reality around them thin enough to pass through. Mizuchi regrets his words.
Please don't go.
He stands and offers a hand.
Stay, at least for a while. We still have so much to speak on.
Deku is going to try to restore what All for One has taken, she tells him and watches as he finds himself shocked into place. I don't know if he can. I don't know what harm will fall to him in the attempt, but I do know I will not stand idly by and leave him to fate, not when he has refused to do so for any of us in turn. She turns her back on him, and he feels suddenly too old and too young at once, despite his true age. She does not wait for his rebuttal. She slices through time and disappears from their space between, and leaves him alone with his thoughts. They do not make good company. Nezu surveys the examination room they have been assigned for this process with a careful eye. It's a decently sized space meant for observation. One wall has a large glass partition where additional machinery is kept, and there is room for more than simply doctor and patient. 2 beds have been arranged in the center of the room, crisp linens waiting occupation. Next to them sit 2 EEG devices, wired and ready, and Nezu recognizes the standard arrangement of pulse and oximeter monitors with the phemia of things used to ascertain that human baseline is, in fact, remaining so. Behind the glass are machines and computers that will use the room's sensors to judge quirk activation, judge power output, and even read the radius of Deku's power. The walls are lined with gofu, marked, Nezu's nose is sensitive enough to pick up on it, with blood. It's subtly done as well. He doubts the humans around him have noticed the fact, or he is sure they could comment. It further adds weight to Deku's beliefs, if he is willing to add something like blood for verisimilitude. It could be subterfuge, of course, designed to convince others, but the subtlety of the markings leads him to suspect it was done in earnest. Of course, there is the consideration to be made that Deku has done so knowing that Nezu himself would read the blood on the papers and make the same judgment about his dedication to this cause. Nezu does not negate the possibility. It is simply a far less likely option based on current parameters. In the corner of the room, Aizawa speaks with Deku quietly. Nezu can hear the words, even though he knows he is not meant to. They are reassurances, traded between one another. Deku promising to protect himself from his spirits, Aizawa promising to protect Deku from humanity. It is heartening to see the two of them so clearly bonded. It makes things easier. Easier, because magic should not exist, certainly, but part of his intelligence means that Nezu himself is aware of how much he still does not know, and how much humanity has still yet to learn. There are gaps, large ones, in quirk knowledge. Too much quirk theory stands on weak foundations, and studies that were old 50 years ago and now creak on ancient legs. Humanity is too squeamish, in his personal and private opinion. It is probably a good thing he did not go into quirk studies himself. Ethics are, of course, important, but they can be such a roadblock to progress. There are people moving around inside the partitioned room, assistants to the specialist he's called in for this exercise. Ayuki stands beside him and has been a lifelong friend and confidant, or at least for as long as his life of freedom has existed, and an expert in atypical quirk expression and a steadfast and logical mind. Roku is speaking with Totoro and is likewise an expert in quirk factor. He has been the lead specialist dealing with the aftermath of both the Shie Hassaikai and those who have survived falling under All for One's attention. A nurse brings in Tomoko, who looks around the room with the quiet, nervous energy she tries valiantly to hide. She would look well if you did not know her, he thinks to himself. You could consider her color natural if you did not note how valiantly her makeup has been applied to adjust for it. The lines and bruises around her eyes have been deftly concealed, and her smile is the practiced, comforting expression of a rescue hero. She could be well if you did not account for the weight loss, the lethargy, the unexplained chronic pain, the moments of confusion. She could be well if you did not hear Chitara explain the inability to handle groups or crowds, the fear of being alone, the nightmares and cataplexy. He does not know what Deku sees when he walks up to her, but there is something. The boy is brilliant at reading others in very short periods of time, and Nezu watches as he first almost bounds up to the older woman, and then softens himself in the space between two breaths, and he speaks to her more as he does Eri, more as he does to the spirit he calls Tamamo no Mei, than the way he addresses Aizawa. "It's nice to meet you," Deku tells her with a genuine smile. "I don't know what everyone's told you." "You're going to see if you can help with my quirk." Her smile nearly matches his. "Chitara told me because you fixed Mirio's quirk." "I'm going to try." Deku nods and explains what limitations they might have, since he hasn't dealt with quite this situation before. Of course, he's apparently dealt with quite a few different situations over the last few years. Nezu had sat with him and carefully drawn out story after story about fixing quirks, up to and including removing them. Deku calls it disconnecting, of course, but the result is the same. Most of the cases are hard to follow up on, of course. Deku barely has names to offer, but a few of the descriptions of quirks and ages, especially regarding children, had brought some results, and money, especially in a place like Kotobuchiko, could encourage all sorts of memories to surface. There is no real understanding of Deku's ability or limits, not even from the boy himself. And then, of course, there is the case of young Yuna to consider, or what he has done for Eri and Mirio. Both happened under Nezu's careful gaze and Yue's censors, what little they had been able to pick up, and still they do not know anything near enough. Really, when faced with an ability like Deku's, Tomoko's condition, as regrettable as it is the perfect chance to study what he can do, and potentially examine the limits. They are miles from Tartarus, all for one is well and truly contained, and the machinery here is far better at picking up nuance than the more simple machinery at UA, as this is not obligated to be hidden. As unethical as it might be, Deku's quirk or ability works needs to be studied, and the sooner the better. If he can be influenced by outside quirks or spirits, then they need a solid plan of action to protect him. And if he is, in the unlikely event, playing a very long game or falls into the hands of those less scrupulous than UA staff, then they need a better idea of how to stop someone with his kind of power. Izuku sits on the medical bed with his legs hanging over the side, while everyone moves in organized chaos around him. There is a plastic band around his forehead that sits behind his ears, and wires trail down from it. Other wires are stuck to his temples, and the back of his neck, and even in his hair, the adhesive a little itchy, and they all trail to a machine at the side of his bed. There's a monitor on his finger for his pulse, and a few other things on his arms and chest that he honestly doesn't recognize. Tomoko has the same treatment, looking nervous and bouncing slightly, leaning into Chitara while the doctors make sure everything is working. The spirits all around him are reassuring. He's met the 3 spirits of the Wild Wild Pussycats, all of them cat-themed, which makes him wonder if they'd always had that form or chose it to match their humans. And Sun Eater's octopus Oku is hovering in the corner just in case. Izuku's not calling on his power now, just in case it makes the process of all these machines harder, but he'd eaten some canned clams before they started to show Aizawa that he really could armor himself just in case, and that had worked out well. Tamamo no Mei didn't say very much at all when she arrived, but she'd given him a smile. So maybe she doesn't hate him after all. He's not brave enough to ask her yet, though. It's enough that she's here to help. "All right," Dr. Ayuki says, and it's frightening to be here and to be dealing with doctors and to be on this bed. But it's not too much. He's doing it for Tomoko, and he's doing it for himself. And no one has called him crazy yet, and Aizawa promised no one would. "Now, from my understanding, you use your quirk to reach and read someone else's quirk factor.
through a mark on your hands. Can you give us a brief example so we can ensure that everything is calibrated?
Izuku nods, but Nezu interrupts. Actually, he says from his position, standing on a chair so that he's of the same height as everyone else, which would look silly on anyone else, but just makes perfect sense for him. Deku, if you would, could you simply reach for the spirit first, not Miss Tomoko?
Okay.
Izuku looks at his options and hesitates because he doesn't want to overstep, and he and Tamamo haven't talked, so he settles on Oku.
How about I just armor my legs?
What? Izuku just asks and receives the spirit's power as it floats down to him, his lower legs gaining a thick layer of hard calcium around them, though not so much to rip his pants. The plan is to tug his pant legs to show them, but of course the minute he actually starts to channel Oku's power, everything starts to scream! He stops and the machines, save for one, all stop blaring alarms, but the one that keeps alarming is so loud he has to cover his ears against it, and his heart is pounding and he can smell antiseptic and he's cold and it's suddenly very, very hard to breathe. More hands cover his and someone shouts and the noise stops. Izuku smells cologne. No one wore cologne at the Institute. There were rules against it. And he looks up, and Aizawa is in front of him, covering his ears still, and giving him a worried look. You all right? He asks, lips moving slowly enough for Izuku to read them. He doesn't take his hands off of Izuku's own, off of his ears, blocking out the sound. Izuku shudders and breathes in deep. The cologne is stronger than the smell of hospital this close, and smells fresh, like Aizawa just put it on. He feels his eyes water.
Did he seriously put on cologne for me?
He asks Tamamo. He is prepared for you, kid. If you are doing this, you are doing it as protected as he can make you.
Izuku would give anything to be alone with Aizawa for 5 minutes just to ask for a hug. But there are too many people, too many spirits. So he breathes again and nods, tucking his hands free. Sorry, he says to Aizawa, but really to the whole room. That was loud.
It startled me, too, Tomoko says instantly, and Izuku notices she's clutching her hands together, so it probably isn't just her trying to make him feel better. What was it?
Told you it was going to be a problem,
Aizawa says, hand on Izuku's shoulder now and glaring at Nezu.
If he disappears from camera feeds, he's going to interrupt things here.
But not audio recordings, Nezu points out. We should not proceed assuming that nothing will work, Aizawa, but rather that everything should work, and then calibrate based on actual empirical evidence. Should we not? Aizawa says something under his breath that Izuku catches as, we shouldn't be doing this at all. But he doesn't say it loud enough for Nezu to respond, so everyone pretends he didn't say anything at all. They have to fiddle with the machinery, which makes Izuku nervous, which makes Aizawa hover closer and squeeze his shoulder more. Everyone waits until Dr. Ayuki nods and says, "Try again!" Less screaming machinery, but the one that's connected to all the wires in his head still goes off and keeps going until they unplug it. It takes 3 separate tries before Izuku can use Oku's power, showing off his armored shins to frustratingly annoying surprise from the doctors, and he feels jumpy and wound tight like a spring when they finally declare themselves ready for him to try to do something more, like, actually help Tomoko. He's too wound up to even ask what the heck has been going wrong. He'll ask later if he has the energy to. He just wants this to be done with, wants answers for himself, and to chase away the empty look at Ragdoll's eyes. So it's maybe with a bit stubbornness, a bit of pride, and a bit of desperation when he marks Tomoko's hand with the borrowed Sharpie he's kept from the other place, and then his own. It's a bit of determination to do this and do this right, that when he reaches towards her and hears the machinery scream again, he decides to ignore it and just keep going. Tomoko is a jungle at first glance, but one that looks... Izuku has to search for the word. Desiccated. It looks like a bomb has gone off all at once and everything around him is dead. Her core exists and thrums under his feet, but everything he can see is just empty. When he reaches to touch a vine that hangs down over his head, it turns to dust and collapses into itself, disintegrating into nothing. It is unlike anything he has ever seen before. Even when a spirit dies while connected to someone, rare, but it does happen. Their human keeps a pool of their power. That pool empties eventually without the spirit's connection, but it is there. Even All Might, who had its spirit move on, still has power within him, however weakened. Ragdoll is empty. There is nothing inside of her, nothing of her spirit, or its power, or her quirk, except... Izuku doesn't see the spiderweb thin line. There would be no way to see it with his eyes, a thread in this place of death, but he can feel it. He walks, trying to disturb as little as he can, ignoring the way someone is trying to tug on his body, pushing that sensation away as unimportant. He's somewhere safe for the moment, and Aizawa is looking after him. He tugs on the thread. It feels solid. It feels like a spirit's connection, just spun impossibly thin. He knows, somehow just by touching it, that it cannot be broken by his touch, but that he could break it if he chose to. He knows without knowing quite how that it leads somewhere wrong. Like this, inside of Ragdoll, he is grounded and centered and contained. The thread leads outside of her. The thread, he knows, leads to All for One. He's never tried to be anywhere but inside himself or inside of someone else. He's never wanted to leave his body at risk like that. There were plenty of stories in the Grand Library about spirit walking or monks projecting their spirit far and wide, and all sorts of stories about what could happen if your body was left as an empty shell for anything else to enter. But the hospital room is warded, and he is protected, and he has to know. Izuku lets his grip on Ragdoll go, but does not follow the firm band of power behind him back to his body. He floats and tugs on the spiderweb experimentally, and flies. It is breathtaking. He can't breathe, which he doesn't need to do like this, but always tries to because it's more comfortable to pretend to have a body. He passes through the ceiling, through several floors and people and things, and then the roof, and then he's scrambling to hold on to the thread as he is pulled away from the hospital, heading east. He's moving too fast. He tries to slow himself down, but he can't. The line in his hand is vibrating, and he can't let go. It's pulling him now, away from his body, away from the safety of his wards and protections, away from Aizawa and the spirits who had agreed to protect him. Terrifyingly away from it all. And dragged towards the giant shape of Tartarus that looms on the horizon and gets closer as the world around him blurs with speed. The Greeks thought of Tartarus as a dank and desolate place where those who had crossed the gods and done the unthinkable were held. For most of its occupants, it stood as a sentence of eternity, of toil and despair and futility, a place even the gods themselves would not wish to visit, a place of the eternally damned and the morally corrupt, where Sisyphus endlessly pushed his burden and where Ixion lies forever strapped to a burning wheel. The walls of Tartarus are meant to keep everyone and everything in or out, depending on their position. It is a building made by quirks, quirked construction to make a fortress that can withstand tsunami, flooding, earthquakes, and mere mortal attempts to enter or leave. Security installed by quirked individuals, fine-tuned by them and watched by them. Sensors monitor every living being inside of the building. Their heart rate, their temperature, their power levels, their REM sleep, and their bowel movements. There is no privacy. There is no freedom. There is no doubt that every prisoner deserves their fate. Tartarus stands as an impenetrable fortress where only the truly despicable and truly dangerous are placed and kept under constant unblinking surveillance. Izuku flies even closer overhead, struggling to free himself to no avail. Inexorable force holds him in its grip, and he stops for a moment only when he is hovering a few dozen feet above the center of the gold-gray prison. He tries once more to pull away, to hold onto his sense of self and return to his body, but the grip around him refuses to let go. They drag him down. Izuku lands in chaos. It's loud, too loud, impossibly, overwhelmingly awful and oppressive, and he hurts. He's suffocating. He's pressed down and smothered, and there is screaming. No, not screaming. Wailing, begging cries, and his voice joins them without thought, without reason. Just, please, 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 please. Help us. He doesn't know how long he's lost in the sensation, but at some point the line in his hand that is still attached to his hand tugs and drags him along the ground. The sensation of sorts reminds him of where he is, reminds him of who he is, and that these feelings are not his own. It is hard, incredibly hard, to find the space where he ends, and the thoughts of so many spirits begin. But he finds that edge and rebuilds his mental walls until the cacophony is only a dull roar, until he can scrape himself up dizzy and uneasy and afraid of what he'll feel, where he'll be. He staggers upright in a room that is bright and circular, with a man strapped vertically to a medical bed like a horrific Frankenstein's monster, hooked up to tubes and wires and machinery, with what looks like machine guns lining the ceiling of the room aimed at him, and part of Izuku's brain thinks, "That's all for one. That's All Might's nemesis. That's what you are going to become." But it's a very quiet part of his brain, because the rest of his head is screaming in gibbering, horrified, point-blank, disgusted terror. Wrapped around the human, for only Izuku's eyes to see, is something that, once upon a time, was a dragon. Help us! If this mental sense of himself could throw up, it would. The dragon is huge. Maybe 3 times the size of Mizuchi, blue and silver and gold. Izuku doesn't doubt that he was beautiful once. Now, save us! Now there is the bloated, bulging, disfigured shape of something that can only be identified as a dragon because its head is mostly intact, and Izuku can't think of anything else with a body that long with legs, but gods, by all of the gods!
"I smell you,"
it says menacingly, and as Izuku takes an unwilling step forward, he realizes the dragon is blind, or at least its one eye is clouded over and unblinking. The other is nothing but a tumor.
"I smell you, human. I know you are here. Do you think you can hide? Do you think I would not recognize you?"
The voice is male, but tired in a way Izuku has not ever heard from his spirit, ever. It makes him feel exhausted just hearing it. He has to shake the feeling off, strengthens the difference between it, them, and himself.
"What happened to you?"
he asks, even as he takes in everything and knows the answer to that fact. The dragon's form is littered with growths, tumors, bulges, many scaled over, many just part of its body distorted as it is, but not all. No, not all. The line in his hand tugs once more, and Izuku walks before he is dragged closer to one of the dragon's front legs. This one's stuck in position because there is another spirit merged into his side, next to and across the top of the leg, preventing it from moving. It's a large cat with huge ears and spotted fur, and half of it is just merged into the dragon. Its front legs are free, but its back and bottom half are just covered by scales. The dragon is absorbing it, slowly. The cat's front paws reach out, and the line tugs him in, and Izuku touches fur, and the walls around his mind collapse.
"Help us! Save us! Release me! Get me out of there! Oh, gods, please, I'll pay anything! Anything, give anything! Help us! Help me! I can't!
Izuku feels himself bend under the pressure, feels the fracture spread across his mental frame, feels himself begin to fragment under the power of 100, 200, how many voices? Some loud and thunderous, and some sputtering like a dying flame, and every one of them desperate and hurting and clawing and demanding and afraid. So very, very afraid. For a moment he loses himself. For a moment he is adrift in a sea of noise and pain, a speck of dust in a storm. For a moment he feels his edges start to warp, and if he could see, he would realize his hands are beginning to sink into the cat, his whole body following inexorably forward. He cannot give up here. Some small, furious part of himself protests. He will not lose himself. His power flares, explosively filling him from his chest to his fingertips, and then further, brighter, making him bigger. The voices scream, and Izuku screams back, but this time it echoes with his power, his magic, his very soul. Shut up! The world goes white. Izuku feels spread out thin and brittle in pieces until he pulls himself together, like gathering a giant blanket and bundling it up against his chest. By the time he feels like himself, His mental self, at least the world around them, has resolved at least. Somewhat. It is white. Everything is white. There is no floor or walls or ceiling, but he's standing on a surface nonetheless, and there seems to be gravity, and it doesn't feel like the real world, but it doesn't feel like the other place either. In front of him curls the spirit of All for One, but the human is nowhere to be found. "Where's All for One?" he asks before he realizes he's speaking, looking around and wondering if he'll be attacked. If the human was elsewhere like Izuku is now, and might come back now that they've made a fuss. The spirits, the other spirits, are at least quieter. "Why?" the dragon asks, and then there's a mental laugh from it that hurts what Izuku would think of as his bones if this form had them, a deep and powerful ache. "Did you think he and you would meet?" He, if Izuku judges by his voice, asks, "That you would kill him and pick us as your rightful prize?" Izuku takes a step back, confused. I don't know. I thought Mizuchi said we were..." The whole body of the dragon thrashes, and the ache in Izuku's arms and legs grows. "It is not enough to claim one of us, that you must have two. How much more can you glut yourself out there?" "The bridge, he's a bridge, another like it before. Save us, save me, kill him!" The voices begin to grow louder, and Izuku can't take it a second time. "Stop it!" he demands, putting power in the words. He won't deal with being blamed for things he has not done here. "I haven't done anything to Mizuchi," he tells the stunned dragon as the other spirits quiet. "He's in the world with his human right now. I came here..." He takes a breath, even though he doesn't need one, and puts truth into his words. "I came here because I'm the bridge, or a bridge. That's what everyone says, and I don't really know what that means. I came because they told me that Ragdoll's quirk, her spirit, was here, and I wanted to save her and see what Mizuchi meant. That I was like All for One. Is he..." In the space of being able to think and not simply react, Izuku realizes something. If One for All is a complete melding, multiple spirits becoming one, All for One is... "He did this to you!" He breathes out, horrified all over again when he comprehends just what his horrible legacy is supposed to be. This is what they think of when they see him, and Izuku realizes this is why the spirits are so afraid. Maybe they never wanted him to ever truly know, to try to prevent him from doing exactly this. And yet this is a dragon, and Izuku knows how powerful he should be. "Why couldn't you stop him?" The dragon turns, struggling for a moment until warped and disfigured legs can tuck under his form, until he can turn his giant snout in Izuku's direction, until said snout is inches away from Izuku's face, breath hot and repugnant. "By the time I thought I should, child, I was too late. I was as trapped as any of the others, and he would not die!" Izuku stares at the tumor on the side of the dragon's mouth. If he looks closely with more than his eyes, he can see the spirit curled inside and slowly being crushed. "This is wrong!" He says it, knows it, feels it even in this strange nothing space. "Can I help them? If I'm like him, can I undo it?" There's a silence and then a roar of "Help us!" that staggers Izuku back, hands covering his ears, even if it doesn't actually help against the sound. This time it's the dragon that quiets them in turn, and Izuku looks up to see one cloudy eye staring at him, the dragon's whole head moving to try to get a view of some sort. "Who are you, child?" And isn't that the question of the hour? Izuku laughs softly. "My name's Deku. I don't enslave spirits, not even the ones who hurt me. If I can help you, I'd like to. I will if you let me. You look like you're hurting, and I can feel everyone else's. I don't know if I can, but there has to be something I can do." The dragon's tongue flicks out and runs over swollen gums. Considering or tasting the air, Izuku isn't sure. But eventually it sets its head down on the invisible floor, and Izuku finally gets a solid idea of how exhausted it must be, carrying the extra weight and the screaming minds of spirits for centuries.
"I do not know if you can help,"
he says, the aggression bleeding out of him.
"I do not know if anything save his death would help, but if you can free them, you would free me. Do what you can. Do what you must. I cannot stop you."
He admits, then pauses, thoughtful.
"Mizuchi sent you?"
He sighs.
"That was reckless."
Izuku, now that he can, walks around the dragon.
"He didn't exactly send me. It was a weird conversation we had when he realized I didn't know why everyone hated me, because they thought I was like, you're human. Speaking of, will he show up here, wherever here is? I don't want to start and have him come in or hurt you more. If he's stronger than me, we should make a plan."
The dragon huffs a confused sound before he shakes his head.
"He cannot come here. He cannot see or hear us any longer. He shut us out years ago."
Izuku's initial reaction of, "Wait, I could shut you out?" does not at this exact moment sound like the right thing to say. Maybe something to investigate later, but for the moment there are more important things to worry about. He heads back towards Ragdoll's spirit, which looks at him with wide, dark, bleeding eyes. He's pretty sure the cat is a she. Paws at the air as he approaches.
"Everyone needs to stay calm,"
he tells her, and hopefully the rest of the spirits are listening.
"If you overwhelm me, I can't do anything."
The sound of agreement is a susurration instead of a cacophony. A good start.
"How do you know Mizuchi?"
Izuku asks the dragon while trying to examine where the spirits are joined. Usually he'd just reach with his power, but right now he's pretty sure he is his power, and that's not confusing at all. Of course not.
"He is my brother," the dragon answers. "I forbade him from ever seeing me like this."
Well, no wonder Mizuchi hated him at first sight, Izuku thinks. It would have helped if someone had said so, but saying so and spirits seem to be a bad combination.
"He's probably worried about you,"
Izuku offers, but he's not really focused on the conversation. His hands itch. Everything about the dragon is wrong to him, and the longer he stays in its presence, the worse he feels, and all he really wants to do is... He sets his hands on the cat spirit once more, this time under her front legs. He isn't exactly thinking about things, and maybe that's for the best, because all he wants to do is save her and the others and reunite her with Ragdoll, and he pulls! The cat, Hashi, he suddenly knows, tears away from the dragon's side. Literally. Izuku stares at the gaping hole in horror, even as Hashi licks a terribly rough tongue up his cheek. "Thank you," she says, and then she disappears. Back to Ragdoll, he can only hope, but his attention is still on the open wound in the dragon's side where the cat spirit had been. It doesn't bleed, but that's the only saving grace it has. Izuku sets his hands on either side and tries to see if he can maybe heal it, but the dragon rolls out of his reach.
"Leave it,"
the dragon orders, rolling back a moment later.
"It's a flesh wound. I am far stronger than that. Cut out the rest, child."
That is said with a bit more force and, if Izuku wants to label anything, desperation.
"Save your energy to deal with them and free me from this curse. Quickly!"
The words echo in his head. He's sure the other spirits are clamoring again, but Izuku doesn't quite hear them. He has to free them, has to free this dragon, has to keep working as quickly as he can. He reaches for the next spirit, a tiny ball of white flame, buried directly under the dragon's thick hide. The scales split under his hands, but he doesn't stop to think about it. Doesn't stop to think about anything. Later, much later, he'll realize that a human with the power of 100 or more spirits might mean a spirit with such power as well, but it is far too late to change things by then. He has a job. He has a duty. This was what he was made for. To set things right. Shota watches Deku with genuine fear. Whatever he's done, whatever he's doing, Deku's not responding to any of them, and apparently half of the monitoring devices have just stopped even trying to do their jobs. He does not say, "I told you so," again, because there is no point, but he is glaring at Nezu with all his power. He keeps it to Nezu, however, because he has to at least admit that Ragdoll, Tomoko, looks about as bad as had been implied, and while he's angry about all of this, he's not going to be the one to make it worse. This could have been done better in a dozen different ways, but they're here now, and all he can do is wait and hope that the help Deku had promised he'd have would be enough. He waits. He waits, and the clock ticks by, and nothing changes. Tomoko and Tartarus speak quietly, the doctors flurry around the machinery. Shota keeps himself firmly planted 2 feet away from Deku, leaning against the wall but in plain sight because Deku sometimes comes back disoriented and he doesn't want the kid to see hospital lights and panic. They wait. The first sign something is wrong is just a shadow in the corner of his eye that Aizawa looks at directly only to have it disappear. The first time means nothing, could be anything at all, but the 6th time it happens is a problem! He wonders if anyone else is picking up on it and realizes Nezu's sharp gaze is slowly canvassing the room from one side to the other.
You saying things too?
I am picking up the impression of something certainly, but it is a visual cue only,
says the principal, his nose doing that scrunch thing when he tests the air.
You have a fine taste in cologne, Aizawa.
Shota decides to let that slide for now. The flickering gets stronger and he stops trying to look at it head on. It's been almost half an hour, twice as long as any of Deku's other sessions, and still he hasn't twitched, not even when Dr. Ayuki pricked his finger. Shota does not want to think about what that might mean exactly, so he focuses on the shadow shapes. If he doesn't look directly, they don't seem to disappear. Tomoko gasps, her whole body jerking with a start, and her monitors go off in various loud beeping ways. Chitara gathers her to his chest, and she shakes, looking around at the doctors and then to Shota, who, hell, she could probably read how frustrated and upset he is right now if he's guessing right. "It's Buck!" she says, tears glistening in her eyes, but they do not spill. "It's Buck! I can feel everyone! I can..." She blinks and stares at Deku, expression shifting from relief to a worried frown as her lips press together.
What's wrong?
Shota demands, sharper than he ought to be. Tomoko shakes her head. "He's not inside himself. I don't know where he is, but..." Deku glows. It is a flash for only a moment, but it fills the room with light that has a physical presence. When it passes, Shota blinks, and shadows that had hovered just out of sight resolve themselves into spirits. A lot of spirits! To say that everyone reacts badly is a bit of an understatement. Both doctors jump back, possibly because their proximity to a quartet of wild cats. A tiger, some sort of desert-looking cat, something huge and white, something smaller with far too sharp-looking teeth, all standing around Chitara and Tomoko, who at least seem to take their namesake in some sort of stride. They just freeze up. Nezu, however, only freezes after he has managed a death hold on Shota's scarf, tucked into the folds of it, and tiny back paws digging sharply into Shota's back. All things considered, Shota has to grant that it is probably the principal's best course of action. Of course, those aren't the only spirits. There's a strange multicolored octopus thing floating above their heads, and there's... Thank everything! Tamamo no Mei, seriously.
It's like, fuck.
He says to her directly, despite the fact that he knows she should not be visible. He's not going to question it yet.
Is Deku okay? What's happening?
She says something. He doesn't hear her. Well, fuck.
We've got visual, but no sound.
He tells her as she seems to realize he can see her, shifting back and forth, half phased through a chair.
So we're playing charades. Do you know where Deku is?
She shakes her head, human-shaped at the moment, so at least she isn't taking up too much space. Another flash of light and a ball of white fire appears, flying around the room frantically, followed by a one-eyed 2D black shadow thing, followed by what Shota is pretty sure is a porcupine.
Oh,
fuck, he breathes out, staring at Deku, and then to Tamamo no Mei.
He's freeing spirits, isn't he?
Because how did they not see it? It's so obvious. If he was doing something to find Tomoko's spirit, then if there were others that needed help... Even he'd forgotten the finer points of how Deku's world worked. It was easy to think that distance made space for people and that Deku would be safe with guardians. Well, maybe not easy. He'd been worried about something coming after Deku this whole time. He hadn't considered Deku going to them! Tamamo no Mae nods and then winces as a series of lights, like fireflies, tiny balls that slam into walls and doors and windows over and over again, appear. She says something, but Shota still can't hear her, and his lip reading is good but not that good when he doesn't have context clues at all, and then one of the fairy lights slams into Tamamo no Mae from the back. She staggers, and so does Shota. He very nearly falls, but he catches himself on the wall.
Literally!
He catches himself with the 6-inch metal claw nails he now has extending from the ends of his fingers. Nezu peers out from over his shoulder.
Interesting,
He says in a voice that Shota thinks is the most unnerved that he has ever heard from his principal. Aizawa looks over at Chidori and Tomoko, the two of them staring at Chidori's now flaming hair and Tomoko's glittering skin. Dr. Ayuki and Dr. Roku are staring in equal horror and scholarly fascination as they try to keep Dr. Ayuki's feet on the ground instead of floating a few inches away from it.
I'm just going to say it,
Aizawa says as he yanks on his left hand until he can free his new claws from the wall. They seem exceptionally sharp when he tests them gently with the pad of his thumb. Hopefully this is short-term or retractable, otherwise marking is going to be hell.
I told you this was a bad idea.
Izuku feels like he's floating. Separating out the hundreds of spirits is draining, but he can't stop. He can't stop because the dragon will not allow him to stop. The dragon, and somewhere in all of this with blood on his hands, Izuku knows that this is Ryujin, has learned this name the way he's already gathered hundreds of others, has him under a command. Ryujin orders him to cut out the spirits that plague his frame, and so he does. Their common names pass through Izuku's hands, and their true names echo behind, offering themselves up for the taking, floating tantalizingly close. He does not reach for them. He moves on to the next spirit, the next cry for help, the overwhelming noise of everyone together slowly growing weaker as more and more voices leave them to go somewhere else. Some of the spirits are so weak they can't find their way out. They cling to him, lost and afraid of him, and yet more afraid of going back to where they were. They are not truly themselves anymore, Izuku thinks. They've been drained nearly dry until they are just echoes of what they had once been, until they are a single power, a quirk, and nothing else. Those he nudges along, only paying half a mind to them in the process, telling them to use his tether back to himself as a guide, the way he'd used Hashi's connection to Ragdoll to come here. The way Hashi had used her connection to pull Izuku along. He doesn't know how long he works, how many names he's learned, or how many spirits he's freed. There was no real sense of anything but the next cry for help, and the next, and Ryujin twisting himself for Izuku to have access to the countless bodies that litter his sides. When Izuku's hands reach for the next spirit and find nothing, he blinks into awareness. There is silence. The spirits are gone. The pressure of their demands, their needs, their cries for help, all soothed into nothingness. He stands and stares at his hands and realizes they are covered in blood. Ryujin lays on his side, head curled towards Izuku, his one eye half-lidded, the other a gaping wound where a spirit had been. To match the hundreds of others, some deep, some shallow, that carve up the dragon from nose to tail. Izuku wavers. He feels himself sway, and it's as though his own shape is hard to hold, like his edges are blurry, and he wants to cry.
I am sorry, Ryujin says, voice quiet. I did not want to risk that you would stop halfway, but you've used too much.
Izuku goes from standing to sitting without any motion between. His form simply changes. He leans against Ryujin's neck, one small bare space without injury.
I need...
He says the words slow like they're made out of syrup.
I need to fix you. You're hurt.
He knows how to heal. He doesn't have much power though, and this is terrible. He did this. He has to fix this. It's his job to fix things. That's what he's good for. That's all he's good for.
I hurt you. Child,
Ryujin's voice is like water, Izuku thinks, cool and calming. Mizuchi's voice is like a raging river, but Ryujin's is nice.
Child, I bade you, and you obeyed, and that you did not fight me tells me all too much. I have seen your mind, child. I have seen your heart. Listen to me. Listen to the words I say.
Izuku nods. He can do that. He can listen.
A bridge is not simply the path between 2 points, child. A bridge can also be the anchor on each side that connects them. A bridge is not just the stones it is made of. It is the purpose it serves.
Izuku nods again.
Okay,
he says, so tired now, so empty. It takes energy to hold himself together, and there's almost no one left he has to hold together for. If he lets go, he doesn't know what would happen. Perhaps he'll drift away like the spirits. That sounds nice.
Thank you, child.
Ryujin shifts, even though he shouldn't, even though it must hurt him to do so. He shifts, and Izuku falls from leaning against his neck and lays on the strange knot ground and stares up at the endless white of the night sky and wonders if he'll become a spirit when he dies, or if he'll be able to see his mother again. A giant bloodied snout covers his whole chest. The breath from it is so hot it almost burns, and then it does burn! Izuku screams as power floods him, more than he's ever held in his life, more than he's ever known. He pushes himself up, suddenly clear-headed and aware, and cries out a second time when he realizes Ryujin is fading. Don't! Izuku demands, hands outstretched, trying and failing to give the power back. Don't! I don't need this! I was supposed to free you! Let me heal you! Don't give up now! He is in fact crying, even though he wasn't sure this sense of himself could. Please! He doesn't want to be responsible for the death of a spirit, of a dragon, of someone important. He doesn't want Ryujin to die. He doesn't want to be blamed for it. He doesn't want the one person who might possibly be able to explain things to leave him. He doesn't want to admit how selfish he is. Please, he begs, knowing it's hopeless when half of the dragon's form is already gone from sight. Please don't go.
You freed me,
Ryujin says gently.
You have given me the death I craved, even if I used you to accomplish it. Thank you, child. You will forever have my gratitude.
Izuku doesn't get to argue further. Ryujin fades into nothingness and leaves him alone.